Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I see a lot of familiar faces. And for those who don't know me, my name is Ashley Buck. I'm a junior in applied psychology and the Global Public Health program here at NYU Steinhardt. And before we get started on today's presentation, I just wanted to thank the Department of Applied Psychology for the generous Professional Development Award that will allow me to present at the EPA, Eastern Psychological Association's annual conference in Boston next week. This presentation is a brief glimpse into what I will be presenting in the undergraduate poster presentation. Additionally, I would like to thank Dr. Sai and Grace Singh for allowing me to use their data for the secondary data analysis, as well as for their mentorship for this project. So let's get into how social connectedness mediates the relationship between perceived discrimination and psychological distress. So to give some background context, there are over 1.2 million international students studying here in the US, many of whom often have to navigate multiple stressors across academic, social, and cultural domains. And of this 1.2 million international student population, Chinese international students make up about one of the larger subgroups with over 250 students. Additionally, as we have observed during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was an 145% increase in reported Asian hate crimes, increasing the need to understand protective factors against discrimination and hate in this population. So, what is perceived discrimination and hate? Within the culturative stress model, perceived discrimination refers to the equitable treatment or denial of opportunities based on race or color, whereas perceived hate reflects interpersonal hostility or de-evaluation toward one's cultural identity or values. In essence, the difference between the two hypothetical constructs is that hate is a more intense form of discrimination, but both forms of rejection threaten basic needs for social inclusion and undermine self-concept, contributing to psychological distress. One pathway we hypothesize that discrimination-related stressors may heighten distress is through the reduction of social connectedness, which is the subjective sense of closeness and belonging in the social world. Literature on social connectedness have been linked to better mental health, higher levels of associations with lower anxiety and depression, and in contrast, low connectedness reflects diminished belonging and greater withdrawal from social opportunities, increasing vulnerability to psychological distress. Based on the minority stress theory, stigma-related stressors such as discrimination and hate are theorized to erode social and interpersonal functioning, heightening social vigilance and anxiety in social engagement, and thereby conferring risk for psychological distress. The larger literature has provided empirical evidence showing associations between racism, health outcomes, and adjustment difficulties. Guided by this larger literature, we examine whether social connectedness mediates this association between perceived discrimination and hate and psychological distress amongst Chinese international students. Going on to the methods, the participants consisted of 130 Chinese international students from over 40 universities across the US, recruited through various social media campaigns, as well as from international student serving organizations from 2022 to 2024. Participants were asked to complete 3 online surveys for a larger expressive writing intervention study, and this study pulled from the baseline survey, pre-expressive writing intervention. The statistical analyses were conducted using Hayes process macro for SPSS. The study drew from 5 different measures with questions like, I'm treated differently because of my race. I don't feel I participate with anyone or any group. Over the last 2 weeks, how often have you been feeling down, depressed, or hopeless? And I'm unable to reach out and communicate with those around me. For the statistical regression analysis, we observed associations between perceived discrimination and perceived hate to the outcomes of anxiety and loneliness, controlling for age and gender. However, we did not find that perceived discrimination and perceived hate were directly associated with depressive symptoms. For the mediation analysis, we conducted 6 mediations for each of the 2 independent variables, the perceived discrimination and perceived hate, and for the 3 psychological distress outcomes of anxiety, loneliness, and depressive symptoms. We found that perceived discrimination was associated with lower social connectedness, higher levels of loneliness, anxiety symptoms, and depressive symptoms. Similarly, for perceived hate, we found that It was associated with lower social connectedness, which in turn was associated with higher levels of loneliness, anxiety symptoms, and depressive symptoms. And to explain these findings and put them into context, we found that Chinese international students who experience higher levels of perceived discrimination and hate experience higher levels of loneliness and anxiety, but not depressive symptoms. Moreover, the associations between perceived discrimination and hate and psychological distress were mediated by social connectedness. Specifically, perceived discrimination and hate was associated with lower levels of social connectedness, which in turn was associated with higher levels of anxiety, depressive symptoms, and loneliness. These findings aligned with the minority stress theory, as mentioned before, in which stigma-related stressors can impair interpersonal function and erode an individual's ability to feel safe and connected within their social environment. Chinese international students who perceive discrimination or hostility may withdraw from social settings, experience increased social vigilance, or feel less accepted by peers and the broader campus community. The reduced social connectedness in turn weakens students' sense of belonging and access to supportive relationship, which is associated with higher levels of anxiety, depression, and loneliness. And interestingly, although we observed that perceived discrimination and hate were not directly associated with depressive symptoms, it was indirectly associated with depressive symptoms through the reduction of social connectedness, possibly due to perceived discrimination and hate diminishing students' sense of belonging rather than through their immediate emotional impact. These results identify social connectedness as a social cultural pathway through which discrimination and hate contribute to psychological distress amongst Chinese international students and underscore social connectedness as an important intervention target. Universities should invest in more programs that further foster social connectedness to mitigate the psychological consequences of stigma-related experiences. These may look like more cultural events, peer mentoring programs, and proactive community building events during orientation. And then this is a brief preview of my poster that I'll be presenting next week. And thank you for listening. Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question, Ashley. Yeah, this is great, really interesting, and you found a lot of results. Uh,
Yeah.
and it's really important. One on the timing of when these data were collected. Yeah, like whether it has been since January of 2025 or before. And then whether the length of time that the students have been in the US was related to their levels of discrimination or perceived hate or social connectedness. Do you have any information on how long they were in the US?
So first one was about the timing from 2022 to 2024, which was right off the heels of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is really interesting to see the increase in Asian hate.
Mhm.
And um, as to their
How long
how long
in the US?
how long they've been in the US. I don't believe we have that information, or that's out of the scope of this particular one, but it would be very interesting to explore in um, further studies.
Mhm.
And addition, perhaps what I would like look at next would be an understanding of what social connectedness looks like for individuals and how that may also affect their perceived sense of discrimination and hate, particularly whether they decide to um, connect with more peers from their particular culture or from the peers with their who are more from peers from more domains mainstream societies like the American society. So that's
Mhm.
might be a different protective factors we can explore in the future.
Mhm. Mhm. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. That was a very amazing presentation. Feel really proud of you for conducting this secondary analysis project and taking the initiative and show so much independence as a researcher and also so much thoughtfulness going into conducting this piece of very important research. So my question for you is that how do you interpret that the perceived hate and discrimination is associated with depressive symptoms only indirectly, and when you look at the direct associations, that you don't find that as significant results?
Yeah, it's very interesting that we see that it's mainly the significant findings are mainly seen through the uh, indirect relationship. Um, and that we think that that might be because perceived discrimination and hate diminishes students' sense of belongingness in their communities rather than the immediate emotional impact that they may feel um, from anxiety and loneliness. Yeah. Yes.
I was just wondering, how did you define social connectedness in this study?
Mhm. So social connectedness was defined as the subjective sense of closeness and belonging in the social world for students. And this might be how close they feel to the campus community, to their fellow peers in class, and such.
Were there any like interesting findings that you felt like went against your like initial hypothesis in this?
Yeah, definitely the fact that we didn't see any depressive symptoms directly relating to associated with perceived hate and discrimination, because we would have thought that perhaps that um, students who um, felt discrimination and hate would be, in a sense, more depressed. But we found that that was mainly due to the lower social connectedness and that indirect pathway.
Okay, last question. I'm sorry. I think this stuff
No,
is
no
really
worries,
interesting.
all
You know, it's like
good.
a really cool
Yeah.
study. I'm wondering if like in the future you would be interested in looking at like if you think discrimination like primarily like reduces social connectedness or if you think sometimes it like strengthens it within like in-group communities.
Yeah, that would be very interesting to look at and see um, perhaps the other different, perhaps like protective factors and like acculturation status. I think is something that would be very interesting to look at in future studies.
Yeah, this was really cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for your questions.